After 12 years of service, I was fired. Then the Queen asked where I'd gone. The heavy thud of the security seal was the only goodbye Caspian received after more than a decade of keeping a galaxy from imploding. He stood in the sterile, white corridor of the high spire, his worn leather duffel bag slung over a shoulder that felt heavier than the ship-killer missiles he had once redirected using little more than a slide rule and a gut feeling. "Leave the badge on the table, human," said Zora. The High Counselor's voice carried the rasp of dry parchment against stone, her 4 eyes blinking in a rhythmic, dismissive sequence that signaled his utter irrelevance to her species. "Your services are no longer required, and the Queen's recovery will not be disturbed by your departure," she added. Caspian didn't look back at the woman who had spent years trying to calculate his worth and failing because he didn't fit into a spreadsheet. He simply dropped the small, vibrating disk of his rank onto the crystalline surface, the chime echoing through the hall like a funeral bell. He had spent 12 years looking at the stars through the windows of this palace, but most of his time had been spent looking at Aeryn. He could still feel the phantom heat of her skin, a luminous, pale violet that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own heartbeat when they worked late into the cycles. He had been her shadow, her architect, and in the quiet moments when the guards were far away, her anchor. Now, he was just a man with a bag of old tools and a memory of a woman who didn't even know he was being exiled. He walked toward the hangar, his boots thudding against the floor with a heavy, rhythmic finality that the graceful Aethelgard could never quite emulate. The memory of their last night before her stasis burned in his mind like a dying sun. They had been in the strategy room, the holographic display of the sector's trade routes swirling around them like a sea of amber light. Aeryn had leaned over the console, her long, slender fingers tracing a line that Caspian had drawn to bypass a black hole's gravity well. She had turned to him, her silver eyes reflecting the data streams, and for a moment the Queen had vanished, replaced by a woman who looked at him with a hunger that had nothing to do with politics. "You see things in the noise that my people ignore," she whispered. The sound had been low, vibrating in the small of his back, and she had stepped into his personal space, her scent reminding him of rain on hot metal. He had reached out, his rough, calloused hand hovering just inches from the delicate curve of her neck, feeling the static electricity crackling between them. "It is just a human trait, Aeryn," he replied. "We are built to find patterns in the dark," he said. She had closed the gap then, her body pressing against his with a soft, firm pressure that made his breath catch in his throat. Her skin was cool, but where it touched his, a localized fire ignited, a friction that threatened to undo 12 years of professional distance. He had felt the strength in her lithe frame, the hidden power of a species that lived for centuries, yet she had leaned into him as if he were the only solid thing in a shifting universe. Then, the restoration cycle had been called, and she had been led away to the healing vats, leaving him with a promise of a future that Zora had just stolen from him. 3 months after Caspian vanished into the fringes of the human sectors, the Aethelgard Empire began to scream. It started with the logistics. The automated freighters, once guided by Caspian's chaos logic algorithms, began to collide or drift into dead space because they couldn't handle the 3% variance in solar winds that he used to account for by feel. In the council chamber, Zora stared at a wall of red alerts, her fingers twitching over the controls as the economy of 12 systems stuttered. "The processors are working at peak capacity," shouted Atlas. The lead technician's voice was high-pitched with a rising panic that the Aethelgard rarely felt. "The machines say the routes are optimal, but the ships are simply not arriving," he cried. Zora slammed her hand against the desk, her face contorting in frustration. "Then the machines are wrong." She snapped. "Adjust the parameters by the standard deviation," she ordered. But the standard deviation was exactly what Caspian had ignored. He had known that the pilots were tired, that the fuel rods were slightly aged, and that a human merchant would always try to shave off 10 minutes by cutting through a gas cloud. He had managed the Empire through empathy and a deep understanding of the flaws in the system, something the Aethelgard computers could never replicate. As the power grids in the capital city flickered and died, plunging the high towers into a cold, terrifying darkness, Zora finally realized that she hadn't just fired a worker. She had removed the soul of the machine. The pure logic of her people was failing because life was never logical, and the one man who could navigate the mess was gone. The true twist, however, was hidden in the encryption of the central spire. When Zora tried to bypass the failing systems, she found a ghost in the code. Caspian hadn't sabotaged anything. He had simply stopped being the bridge. The entire Aethelgard network wasn't running on a central computer. It was running on a biolink that he had established through a decade of manual overrides. Every time a system glitched, Caspian had fixed it in real time from his personal terminal. Without his constant, intuitive intervention, the Empire was like a body without a nervous system. Zora stared at the terminal, realizing that the human hadn't just been an advisor. He had been the secret engine of their entire civilization. "He didn't leave a manual," whispered Lella. The junior archivist looked at the empty seat where Caspian used to sit, surrounded by half-eaten sandwiches and handwritten notes that made no sense to their mathematical minds. "He was the manual," she said. Zora felt a cold dread settle in her chest as the lights hummed and then failed completely. At that moment, the doors to the Queen's restoration chamber hissed open, the emergency backup power kicking in just enough to reveal a tall, regal figure stepping out of the mist. Aeryn was awake, and her silver eyes were already scanning the darkness for the one person she expected to be waiting for her. She didn't look at the council. She looked at the empty space beside her throne, and the air in the room suddenly felt like it was charged with a localized lightning storm. "Where is my human?" demanded Aeryn. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Zora had ever heard. Aeryn didn't wait for a formal report. She saw the fear in Zora's eyes and the wreckage of her empire's data streams, and she knew. She strode through the darkened palace, her robes snapping like a whip against her legs, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. She was a predator now, her senses heightened by the restoration process, and the scent of Caspian was still faintly embedded in the wood of his desk. She leaned over it, her fingers brushing the place where he had rested his hand, and she felt a surge of fury so intense it made the nearby monitors crack. "You threw away the most valuable asset in the galaxy because you were jealous of his mind," she said. Aeryn didn't turn to look at the counselors trailing behind her like frightened children. "He didn't just calculate our routes, he felt our needs," she added. She turned then, her silver eyes glowing with a faint, dangerous light. "I am going to find him, and if the Empire burns while I am gone, then let it be a pyre for your arrogance," she declared. She moved toward the private hangar, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She remembered the way he had looked at her, the silent devotion in his eyes that she had been too regal to fully acknowledge. She needed him, not just for his chaos logic or his ability to fix a warp drive with a piece of wire, but for the way he made her feel like something more than a figurehead. She wanted the heat of him, the rough texture of his skin against hers, and the way he spoke her name as if it were a prayer. The search led her to a planet called New Haven, a sprawling, neon-soaked rock on the edge of the Perseus Arm. It was a place of smoke, rain, and the constant thrum of heavy industry, a human world. Aeryn stepped off her shuttle, her royal cloak pulled tight around her, the vibrant purple of her skin standing out against the gray, grimy streets. She felt the eyes of the locals on her, but she didn't care. She was tracking a ghost. She found him in a low-ceilinged bar called the Gearbox, sitting in a booth in the back, a glass of amber liquid in front of him. He looked older, more tired, his jaw covered in a thick layer of stubble that made her want to reach out and touch it. "You look like you've seen better days, Caspian," she said. The sound of her voice made him freeze, his hand tightening around the glass. He didn't look up immediately, but she saw the way his shoulders squared, the way his breath hitched in a ragged sob he tried to hide. "The Queen shouldn't be in a place like this," he replied. His voice was a low growl, thick with a mix of pain and a longing that mirrored her own. "I am not here as your queen," she whispered. She stepped into the booth, sliding onto the cracked leather seat next to him, her body immediately seeking out the warmth he radiated. The smell of him, oil, tobacco, and something uniquely human, hit her like a physical blow, and she felt a sudden, desperate need to be closer. The air between them was thick with 12 years of unspoken words and 3 months of agonizing separation. Caspian finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes searching hers for a sign of the woman he loved beneath the crown. He saw the desperation there, the way her pupils were blown wide with a hunger that matched the fire in his own blood. "They fired me, Aeryn," he said. They told me I was nothing but a primitive calculator, he added. Aeryn reached out, her hand diving into the thick hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him toward her. They are fools who cannot see the sun even when it burns them, she hissed. She pressed her forehead against his, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't come here to bring you back to work, she whispered. I came here because I cannot breathe without you, she confessed. Caspian groaned, a sound of pure, unadulterated want, and his hands found her waist, his fingers digging into the soft fabric of her robes. He pulled her onto his lap right there in the dim light of the booth, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was less of a greeting and more of a reclamation. It was a collision of species, of needs, and of a decade of suppressed desire. Her skin against his was a revelation, the contrast of her smooth, alien elegance against his rugged, human strength, creating a friction that threatened to consume them both. He could feel her heart racing against his chest, a frantic drumming that told him she was just as lost as he was. The moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass and the heavy boots of a hit squad. Zora hadn't just let the Queen go. She had sent her own loyalists to ensure the Queen, and the human who held her heart never returned to challenge the Council's power. 4 armed Aethelgard warriors burst through the front door, their plasma rifles humming as they searched the dim room. Caspian reacted before Aeryn could even reach for her ceremonial blade. With a roar of focused, human aggression, he flipped the heavy wooden table, using it as a shield while he pulled a snub-nosed kinetic pistol from a holster she hadn't known he possessed. "Stay down!" he yelled. The kinetic rounds he fired were loud, messy, and devastatingly effective against the energy shields of the alien soldiers. While the Aethelgard relied on precise, programmed firing patterns, Caspian moved with a terrifying, unpredictable fluidity. He used the environment, kicking a chair into the path of one attacker, and using a bottle of high-proof alcohol to create a localized fireball that blinded another. He was a whirlwind of unprecedented violence, showing the aliens exactly why humans had survived on a world that tried to kill them every day. He didn't use logic, he used instinct, and it was a force of nature that the soldiers weren't prepared to handle. Within seconds, the bar was a wreckage of smoke and fallen enemies, and Caspian stood over the last one, his chest heaving, a trickle of blood running down his temple. Aeryn stood up from behind the table, her eyes wide as she watched him. She had seen him move fleets and manage economies, but she had never seen him fight. It was beautiful in its brutality, a display of raw, human capability that made her blood sing. She walked over to him, ignoring the groaning soldier on the floor, and took his face in her hands. "You are a terrifying creature, Caspian," she whispered. Her voice was full of a new kind of reverence, a recognition of the power he had always kept under wraps for her sake. "I'm just a man who doesn't like being interrupted," he replied. He dropped the gun and pulled her back into his arms, his grip so tight it was almost painful, but she welcomed the sensation. She felt the adrenaline coursing through him, the sheer vitality of a species that refused to be quantified or controlled. "We have to go back," she said. "Not because they deserve you, but because I will not let them destroy what we built," she added. Caspian looked at the destruction around them and then back at her, his expression softening. "On one condition," he said. "I'm done being an advisor," he stated. "You'll be my king," she promised. The words were a vow, a shift in the galactic order that would redefine the Aethelgard Empire forever. The return to the high spire was not a quiet affair. Aeryn and Caspian walked through the front gates, their hands locked together, a public declaration that shattered the Council's remaining authority. The Empire was still in a state of collapse, but as soon as Caspian sat back down at his terminal, his fingers dancing across the keys with a renewed purpose, the red alerts began to turn green. He wasn't just fixing the code, he was rewriting the laws of their society. He integrated human gut checks into the automated systems, creating a hybrid logic that was stronger and more resilient than anything the Aethelgard had ever known. Zora was stripped of her rank and sent to the Outer Rim, a fitting end for a woman who couldn't understand that the most important variable in any equation was the one you couldn't measure. In the quiet hours of the first news cycle, Caspian stood on the balcony of the Queen's private chambers, looking out at a galaxy that was finally at peace. Aeryn came up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her head resting against his broad back. They are calling it the human renaissance, she whispered. Caspian turned in her arms, lifting her chin so he could look into her silver eyes. It's just us, Aeryn, he said. It's just a man and a woman who refuse to let go, he added. He kissed her then. A deep, slow exploration that tasted of victory and a future that they would build together, one chaotic, beautiful moment at a time. The stars above New Haven and Aethelgard alike seemed to burn a little brighter, acknowledging the new power that had risen, a union of alien grace and human fire that no force in the galaxy would ever dare to fire again.